Because I have a couple of announcements. First thing I'd like to say is thank you for coming tonight to the GPL. My name is Tim Wiles. I'm the director of the library. And the kind of backstory of how we got Professor Grace here tonight to speak about his book is that we have a mutual friend in Herb Hennings, who's a member of the library board. And I'm surprised that Herb is not here. I'm going to say yet. I imagine he will show up. Herb told me about Tom's book, and I thought that it sounded like a wonderful program. So we got in touch and we arranged the program. Two brief housekeeping announcements. Every once in a while we have a fire alarm in the library, and we do take them seriously. So we have two exits right behind the speaker, and we of course have the exit that you came in from. So if that happens, we'll all go enjoy the nice weather outside. The other announcement is that the restroom is pretty much if you could walk right through that wall, but what you have to do is go out and do a 180 out there. And there's some copies of the library newsletter in the back. I just want to call your attention to one program that I think is worth mentioning and might resonate with you folks. And it is Saturday, October 22nd. We're having our second this year Drug Take-Back Day. So the DEA and the local police get together in our staff parking lot, and they accept over-the-counter medications and prescription medications that are either unused and or expired. And when we did this in May, I believe it was, we collected over 800 pounds of medications. So I was out of town that day, but I imagine it must have been cars streaming all the way through. And this is so important for two reasons. One is that it reduces the number of opioids that are out there in medicine cabinets that kids or other people could get a hold of and become addicted. And the other reason is that when these things are flushed down a toilet or even sometimes thrown in the landfill, they get into the water supply and they cause a real problem for every species, basically. So I wanted to call your attention to that. Professor Grace will have copies of his book for sale for $25 after the presentation. And I'm going to, of course, sit and watch and listen to the presentation. I might have an interesting story about my own history with the history of Kent State, but I don't want to say it now to prejudice the discussion. I think you guys might find it interesting. If I don't remember, you could ask me afterwards. Professor Grace is a professor of American history and culture. Would that be the accurate term?
Well, you could say that.
Okay, yep. The social sciences, perhaps. An adjunct professor at Erie Community College. He's the author of this book, Kent State, Death and Dissent in the Long Sixties, an enlightening first-hand account and discussion of what happened at Kent State on May 4th, 1970. Not only was he an eyewitness, but he was among the 9 who were wounded that day, as well as the 4 who were killed. So I think it should be a fascinating talk. Thanks again for coming out. And Tom, take it away.
Well, good evening to you all. I'd like to begin to thank you for taking your valuable time this evening to attend the talk, particularly if you're a baseball fan. There's, I think, a game that's still going on now, and one that is due to start shortly. So thank you so much for that. I'm going to be thanking a lot of people here, so bear with me while I'm doing so. I'd like to begin by expressing my gratitude to Tim Wiles, the library's director, for doing so much to make the arrangements for tonight's talk. Being the director of programming is just one of the many hats that he wears here at the library, of course. And having organized a good number of programs myself over the years, I know that the hat he wears tonight is one that can sometimes wear heavily. And I appreciate the burden that he has borne to bring me here this evening. I suspect, like many of you, that it was in libraries such as this that we discovered books and our love for them. In fact, libraries number among our favorite public services. Libraries like Bilderland certainly help to entertain us, but more importantly help to nourish our democracy by offering the reading public indispensable knowledge about the responsibility of citizenship. When teaching survey courses, I often remind students of the slogan of the Democratic Republican societies of the 1790s. Quote, Ignorance is the irreconcilable enemy of liberty. I'd also like to thank Herb Hennings. Has Herb come in yet?
He has another meeting. He'll be
Oh, okay.
over.
Well, tell him that somebody said some nice things about him, and that that I remain grateful to him, because it was through Herb, as Tim indicated, that I'm able to be here tonight, because without that linkage, I certainly wouldn't be here. And I'd like to take advantage of my position at the podium to acknowledge some others that are present, because one of the things that, or one of the ways that I've looked at this book that has my name on it is that in many ways I regard it as a collective biography. And no one ever writes a book on their own. And there are many people who are in the audience tonight that have contributed so much to the betterment of our country and the betterment of our world. I just happen to be the one who's up here at the moment. But there's easily a dozen of you, and maybe more, that could be up here holding forth as well. So you'll just bear with me. First, in fact, I was prepared to thank him last June, and I'm glad he's here tonight so I can do so. Jim Kamenesh is a real brainiac, and I always thought of him as PEF's answer to the International Brotherhood of Teamsters. And he was very kind to attend this talk, and he's seated here in the front next to my brother Robert. And while I'm talking about PEF members, ditto for Mike Keenan, who's here in the front as well, because his presence and assistance I'm acknowledging now for the second time in just 3 months' time. And Mike did a lot to bring an audience to a bookstore talk that I did in June, and did so again this evening. And he's one of the labor leaders that I mentioned in the acknowledgments of my book, because there are very few people in the labor movement from whom I learned more about how to be effective in that role than Mike Keenan. And I'm also very pleased to have Sherry Hellbrook here, who I had the opportunity to talk with yesterday, is closing out her third decade as the editor of our magazine, The Communicator, and it's a wonderful piece that brings the union message to 55,000 of our members and to many others of the reading public in New York State. So Sherry, thank you very much for coming. John Flanders, a union activist here in Albany, is a talented writer, photographer, and a first-rate thinker. And he's been kind enough to do some of the videotaping here this evening. Many of these same qualities apply to my friend and former 60s activist, Jeff Jones, who's with us here tonight too, who spent, you talk about spending a lifetime, he has spent a lifetime trying to make ours a better country and world. And indeed, it was his concern for the environment that reunited us. Jeff, I can't remember how many years ago that was, but through my friends and the steelworkers in Buffalo and Jeff's work with the Apollo Alliance, we were able to, who collectively worked to help transition our nation to a cleaner, green economy, is how I reconnected with Jeff. So, Jeff, thank you very much for coming tonight. I also want to thank, my sister Ann, my brother-in-law Louis. I really swelled the audience tonight with family members, and my brother Rob, Rob being a former leader in the Public Employees Federation himself, for their many kindnesses to me, both tonight and always. And quite unexpectedly, I was delighted to see her tonight. My cousin also came, who lives here in the area, my cousin Barbara and her husband George. And thank you so much for coming. It was so kind of you to do that. And while I'm certainly grateful for the opportunity to talk about my book to appreciative audiences, the chance to be with my family and to see old friends such as those here tonight is equally welcome and always welcome. And I won't embarrass her by name, but I went to a lecture last night. It's much easier to attend a lecture than it is to give one. But I went to a lecture last night, and I met a very interesting young woman who recently graduated from Siena College. She told me she loves history. She's here tonight to prove it, two lectures in a row. And she was kind enough to introduce me to some of her professors that she had at Siena College. So look forward to talking with you more after the lecture as well. I have been made aware that my book will eventually be reviewed in as many as 9 scholarly journals, but it is the first online review from which I will quote tonight. A man by the name of William Greer, who, believe it or not, also reviewed the utility of a kitchen sink that he purchased online through Amazon, assessed my book in this way. Thomas Grace tries to sum up the incident at Kent State by giving us the entire history of the radical movement among the students that led to it. Minor error there in his sentence structure. Historically great, but if you wanted a book, air quotes, specifically about the incident, this one takes its sweet time in getting there. And honesty compels me to state that his criticism is accurate. My account of the fatal shootings does not appear until chapter 12 of the book. So not wanting to bother such an impressive group in the manner in which I annoyed Mr. Greer, I will begin with a relatively short reading from the book. And if my intro has a trace of humor, you will find that quality entirely absent from the 3-page passage that I will read. That will be followed by discussion of the main contributions, a relatively brief one, 15, 18 minutes tops, of the main contributions that I feel the book makes to what is known about dissent at Kent State. And after finishing the presentation, I will do my best to answer any questions that you might have. So this is a 3-page selection from chapter 12 that's entitled Right Here, Get Set, Point, and Fire. And the title of that comes from an audio tape that was discovered by a close friend of mine, Alan Canfora, that was also wounded at Kent State. His picture is actually on the cover of the book. And to our mind and the mind of many others, it proved after the passage of 37 years that there was indeed an order to fire at Kent State. So the subhead of this section of the chapter is, it looked like a firing squad. It was almost 12:25 when the guardsmen from Troop G and Company A, these are the Ohio National Guard, reached the apex of the hill topped by the pagoda. Sparse tree growth offered clear sightlines in the direction of the Prentice Hall parking lot. 24 students stood on the open-air terrace adjacent to Taylor Hall, observing the action, some about 50 feet from where the 2 guard units had stopped abruptly. Student Jim Menard saw Major Harry Jones, a National Guard officer, signal to the students by waving his baton in a downward motion. Another nearby student, Harry Montgomery, he a Vietnam veteran, saw Sergeant Myron Pryor tapping guardsmen on the back just before they halted, while a third student, Charles Deegan, he a member of the United States Marine Corps Reserve, but there as a student at Kent State, fixed his gaze on the same sergeant, tapping people on their helmets and shoulders, putting them in line. That was a quote. Deegan also heard, quote, someone yell, form up, and then the guardsman turned, end of quote. 25-year-old guardsman Richard Love thought as well that he heard Major Jones yell, form up, and turn and face the crowd. Following the signals from Sergeant Pryor and Major Jones, and the verbal orders from an officer, quite possibly Major Harry Jones, many of the 76 troops stopped between the pagoda, it was actually an inverted umbrella in an architectural structure on the campus, and the edge of the Taylor Hall veranda, while others momentarily continued their march in the direction of the Commons, an area where this protest had started about 25 minutes earlier. More than half, among them 27-year-old Lloyd Thomas of Troop G, responded to the command to turn around and stand your ground, end of quote. Most of the active protesters were nearly 100 yards away in the Prentice Hall parking lot. What happened next is still the topic of sharp debate. A Kent State employee who unexpectedly found himself near the guardsman heard an officer give the command, quote, to turn and fire 3 rounds. Many of the men in the 2 units rotated 130 degrees and aimed their rifles at students further down the hill towards the more distant parking lot, at least 260 feet away. Bob Pickett, this was a man who had been vice president of the student body, saw Major Jones, an officer he described, quote unquote, with a soft hat, make a motion, after which the guardsman, quote, turned simultaneously and began to fire. From his position on the veranda, Harry Montgomery, I mentioned him earlier, the Vietnam veteran, identified Sergeant Fire, quote, as the first one to turn, aim his pistol, and fire. Kent State freshman Rich Levenger saw the same thing. Quote, one guardsman with a pistol shot first, and then the others opened up. Eyewitness memories of the spoken orders soon became garbled, but a long overlooked portion of an audio tape leaves little doubt. One or more voices can be heard shouting, right here, get set, point, and then the beginning of the word fire. It was then, 24 minutes into the confrontation, that the first deadly shots rang out. So I'm going to stop there because this can get lengthy, but those of you that either want to get the book tonight or consult your library, you'll be able to read more about what took place. And I'm going to pick up now with a prepared presentation that I have that will help amplify and extend the discussion that I've just started with the reading. So observers recorded the time as 12:24 under a bright sky but thick with the haze of tear gas from a battle not half hour old. Veteran Ohio National Guardsmen, responding to hand signals and verbal orders, suddenly turned in unison. The soldiers unleashed a salvo that cut through the near-deafening roar of hundreds, if not thousands, of voices. In less than 13 seconds, a burst of fire brought down 13 students, killing 4 of them outright. Crack, crack, 2 shots, and then a volley between 61 and 67 shots fired by a contingent of 28 Ohio National Guardsmen, end of quote, is how a reporter for the Cleveland Press described the scene. Decades later, he recalled the day, quote, I remember the sight of one of the casualties, probably Joseph Lewis or Thomas Grace, pirouetting violently in the air and falling to the ground, end of quote. In the year 2000, on the 30th anniversary of the killings, the reporter asked, quote, why Kent? Why this middle-of-the-road state school in the middle of America, end of quote. My own questions are the same, yet sometimes different, than those asked by the journalist who authored the first draft of history. The initial press treatments of the slayings at Kent State contributed to myths that continue to have currency. On location for the New York Times, Andrew Malcolm reported the day after the killings that the protest at Kent State over the Cambodian invasion had marked the first campus disturbance since a panty raid in 1958. Other papers also airbrushed Kent's decade of dissent. The Washington Post editorialized, quote, it's almost beyond belief that the ultimate tragedy in the opposition to the war came in the heartland of America. Kent State cannot be brushed aside, end of quote. The paper insisted that Kent, Ohio was in, quote, the great center of the country, where the great mass of silent students dwell, end of quote. So sympathetic editorial writers reasoned that events at Kent State proved, at least in their mind, that the nation's geographic and figurative center had turned against the Southeast Asian conflict. In their minds, this proved that the political heart of America had turned against the war. After the passage of 3 decades and numerous books on the shootings, the view of Kent State before 1970 remained that of an activist backwater. The late David Halberstam, I'm sure some of you are familiar with his many fine books, continues to represent the dominant thinking about how the killings figured in the Vietnam era of American history. Halberstam, who spoke at Kent State in 2000 on the 30th anniversary of the shootings, asserted that Kent, Ohio was, quote, among the least likely places to find a shrine commemorating civilian victims of a bad war. A campus like this, so distant physically and emotionally from the center of the anti-war movement, end of quote. So before trying to figure out what Kent State was and wasn't, some background on Kent State is in order. In the spring of 1970, America was in the 16th month of Richard Nixon's presidency. The United States was in the 6th full year of military involvement in Vietnam. And despite hopes that the level of American involvement in Vietnam was decreasing, in actuality, President Nixon was bringing some troops home from Vietnam, and there were fewer there then than there had been at the high point of American involvement. President Nixon then startled the nationwide television audience the evening of April 30th with the announcement that United States troops were entering Vietnam's neighbor, the country of Cambodia. College campuses exploded with fury. At Kent State, 3 nights of protest and mayhem ensued. Over 1,000 National Guardsmen were ordered to the campus by Ohio Governor James Rhodes to quell the disorders. Rhodes was then locked in a tight race to determine the winner of a Republican Senate contest and used the events to portray himself as a disciple of law and order. On May 4th, 1970, after dispersing some 500 to 1,000 protesters, as we have just learned, dozens of guardsmen suddenly opened fire on a crowd of asymmetrical students, killing 4 and wounding 9, and the war had come home. I'll now return to the questions posed by the Cleveland Press reporter, quote, why Kent? Why this middling, middle-of-the-road state school in the middle of America? To his questions, I asked my own. Where did Kent's students come from? What do we know about their origins, and what shaped their formative politics? Who were the activists? And what about the Ohio National Guard sent to the campus to suppress the anti-war demonstrations and disturbances in May 1970? Were they, as historian Richard Hofstadter surmised in June 1970, quote, a bunch of confused young National Guardsmen, probably just as confused as the kids they shot? So this was another myth. Who were the National Guard? And were they, as another historian later insisted, by social background, not so very different from the students they'd come to police, end of quote. And lastly, another myth that I address in the book, lastly, did the killing silence dissent at Kent State, as so many historians believe? Focusing on industrial Northeast Ohio, from where most of the students originated, in small-town Kent and rural Portage County, where they went to school, the story of Kent's protest movement can best be understood through the prism of class and racial tensions and concomitant urban small-town strains that influenced the growth of the campus struggle. So we start with the students. While the small city of Kent grew along with the university in the 1960s, at the beginning of the decade, the community of 18,000 people was surrounded by some of the most industrialized cities in America. Youngstown and Warren to the east, Massillon and Canton to the south, Akron, the rubber city at one time, and Barberton, where my friend Alan Canfor was in the cover photo of the book, Barberton, Ohio. And to the north, of course, Cleveland. And to its west, the huge steel mills of Elyria and Lorain. In 1960, every one of these cities had a whopping 40% of its workforce engaged in manufacturing. Barberton had 63% of its workers employed in industrial production. So this didn't even count, the bus drivers and the school aides and the kindergarten teachers and the people who worked as clerks in the store or the waitresses. All of the other blue-collar workers didn't even count them. These were just people who worked in industry, to give you an idea of how industrialized Northeast Ohio was. Due to its seemingly innumerable farms in many small towns, Ohio has and retains a conservative tradition. Yet 50 to 60 years ago, its northeastern cities were home to black and white Southern migrants, Catholic ethnics, and Jewish Americans, all mainstays of the Democratic New Deal coalition. The children of the urbanized working class who attended Kent State came from these Northeast Ohio cities and made up approximately half of all the students at the university in 1960. Even as the percentage of urbanized youth at the university declined during the decade, in raw numbers, there were more working class students at Kent in the late 60s than there were 10 years earlier. One of the few historians who have previously written about Kent State did much to unearth the early history of dissent at the Northeast Ohio School, yet he too puzzled as to the why of Kent State. He wrote that the campus, quote, seemed like an unlikely place to have a student movement in the early 1960s. So how do we figure this out? Why was Kent a place where all this happened instead of like Youngstown or Akron University? Looking 30 miles to the north, however, we have our answer. It was Cleveland's political culture that had an enormous effect on the student movement at Kent State. The city's labor, civil rights, peace, and later anti-war organizations and the presence of old left groups significantly influenced the emergence of a student movement at Kent State. So did Cleveland's music scene. As I tell people, the Rock and Roll Hall of Fame is located in Cleveland for good reason. In summary, the black and white working class Ohioans and out-of-staters, chiefly students from Pittsburgh and greater New York City, and after a time from Western New York as well, who attended Kent State in the 1960s were a breed apart and had an uneasy relationship with Kent's small-town Protestant and Republican culture. The growth of Kent's student movement paralleled that on other campuses, albeit without much national attention. Early 1960s protests focused on supporting Southern civil rights sit-ins, integrating local public accommodations, and eliminating racial segregation in off-campus housing for Kent State students. A few from Kent went south, including one who joined a group known as the Freedom Riders in 1961. He spent about 90 days in Parchment Farm for his trouble. As students carved out political space for their right to protest, the campus was witness to free speech battles over speaker choice, as well as for freedom of assembly and organization. The right to form student chapters of the Congress of Racial Equality and the Young Socialist Alliance became subjects of bitter campus debate, as did the first protests of the Vietnam War in 1964, and especially in February of 1965. Anti-war activism grew steadily but slowly at Kent State. It's important for us to remember and to realize. Much of the pioneering anti-war cohort came from socialist or old left families. The majority of Kent's working class students, however, were from families that had embraced Cold War liberalism. And this was a complicated belief system, Cold War liberalism. I know because I was one of them. That involved varying degrees of support for racial tolerance, a dedication to labor rights, and a positive image of government, but one that also maintained a commitment to the containment of communism. Only after the convulsions that rocked the Democratic National Convention in August 1968, when hundreds were beaten by Chicago police on national television, did significant numbers of Kent students come to embrace anti-war radicalism. A confrontational chapter of the Kent Students for Democratic Society soon emerged and was the outgrowth of this Chicago protest. SDS, as it was known, formed an ephemeral alliance with the Black United Students at the university in 1968. A struggle ensued between activists and the administration, which culminated in the spring of 1969 with arrests and suspensions of 80 activists, the banning of the SDS chapter. It was only one of 6 in the entire United States that was actually banned from a college campus, and the investigation of the radical student group by the United States House of Representatives Internal Security Committee. Some of us may remember that as the House on Un-American Activities. Even with the destruction of SDS, as many as 5,000 students demonstrated against the methods used by the university to assail the radicals. When school resumed, this was all in the spring of '69, when school resumed in the fall of 1969, after the famous Woodstock Music Festival, Kent was a different campus. Where hundreds had once demonstrated against the war, thousands now did so. Members of Greek fraternities and sororities who had condemned the protest reversed course and embraced anti-war radicalism. So did a growing number of athletes. By the spring of 1970, anti-war clashes in Cleveland, in which Kent students participated, proved to be something of a dress rehearsal for the wave of demonstrations off on a close, yet still unseen horizon. Just as the events of May 4th eclipsed much of the vital prelude at Kent State, the years of protest on the campus that followed were not so much overlooked as they have been ignored. Even a historian who did his graduate work at Kent State, so the evidence was right there in front of him if he had cared to look. And he otherwise wrote a very fine book. And all, a sizable anti-war movement in Kent State persisted as long as did the Vietnam War. I'll conclude with a few comments on the National Guard, for it was their lethal action that put Kent State in the headlines, and it made it a symbol of state terrorism run amok. No state deployed its Guard troops more often than Ohio. While typical duties involve assistance with natural disasters, such as we're now experiencing down in Florida, most deployments in Ohio during the 1960s involved civil disturbances, an astonishing 32 mobilizations between 1965 and 1970. Of the units involved in the shootings, the 107th Armored Cavalry and the 145th Infantry, most of its members had been deployed on numerous occasions prior to May 1970. Indeed, they were policing a wildcat Teamster strike at the time they were pulled off that duty and sent to Kent. Often portrayed as kids no older than the students that they shot, you recall my earlier quote from Richard Hofstadter, their top officers had in actuality experienced long military careers. All were 40 or older. The sergeant who almost certainly triggered the shootings was 42. Company officers were mostly in their 30s. Among the shooters, the average enlisted man was in his 25th year. The youngest was 20. The oldest was 49. Some of the youngest joined the Guard to avoid Vietnam, as most enlisted after the summer of 1965, which was the real major buildup for those who lived through the period will recall in Vietnam. But others signed up to supplement pay from their day jobs, as their enlistment dates were well before the escalation of the Vietnam War. The most common career field of the shooters, this actually surprised me, but perhaps it shouldn't have, was law enforcement. 6 and possibly 7 of the 76 men were police or sheriff's deputies. Other than law enforcement, farming and agriculturally related jobs were the most customary occupations. After the shootings, the Guardsmen were required to prepare after-action reports. In his, Sergeant William Case explained why he had fired in the air. Only God can take human lives, and I didn't get the order from him to aim at any human, no matter how hard they threw rocks. I just couldn't shoot them, he wrote in his report. But Case did not have much company. James Pierce, a member of Case's 107th Armored Cavalry, was more typical, writing in his, after the firing I felt no remorse, because it seemed to be the only way to defend myself, end of quote. An anonymous Guardsman from the same unit complained about the stream of profanity. Now, keep in mind, he's complaining about profanity they endured, and then told the reporter, quote, "It's about time we showed the bastards who's in charge," end of quote. Another Guardsman put it crudely, suggesting that the mission at Kent State involved sanitizing a dirty place. I felt, this is a quote, I felt like I just had an order to clean up a latrine, end of quote. On May 4th, the Washington Post also questioned men from Company A of the 145th Infantry, the other unit on the Hill. Quote, of the Guardsmen interviewed, the reporters wrote, quote, none showed any remorse over the casualties inflicted, end of quote. Identified only as a dairy farmer, one Guardsman mentioned, quote, these hippies and long hairs, if they want to use force, they will receive force, end of quote. A more sympathetic account of the same unit appeared later, but when the reporter questioned men who did not discharge their weapons, his findings were much the same as those of the reporters with the Washington Post. One Guardsman imagined the students having taken their arms. Another forgetting, I'll add parenthetically here, that this one Guardsman said, well, we knew there were a lot of Vietnam veterans among the crowd. And indeed, 1 out of every 10 male students was a Vietnam veteran at Kent State. And he fancied in his mind that they somehow were going to rush up to this body of 50 armed men, take their weapons away, and then turn them on them. And he said, of course, they knew how to use weapons, whereas the other students at Kent State did not. Quite a flight of imagination, but this is what he argued. Another, forgetting that Guardsmen had also thrown rocks at students, recalled the death of the biblical Goliath from the stone. A third insisted on deconstructing the language of the fatal scene, telling the reporter, quote, I don't feel it was a killing. It was a shooting with death involved, end quote. The Post later noted, quote, that the differences between those students and guardsmen go beyond the tragedy at Kent. Remember the quote we had earlier here, that the students and the guardsmen were fairly alike? They are divided by differences in outlook, in background, and behavior, end of quote. An officer who talked with the same Washington Post reporter described the ferocity at Kent State as being like a civil war, end of quote. So in summary, what does a new look at Kent State reveal? A campus populated not with well-born students, but with the sons and daughters of the industrial working class, and by 1970, increasingly of Vietnam veterans, dozens of whom were fired upon by the Ohio National Guard. We have all heard the hoary myth, one disputed by Vietnam veteran Jerry Lemke in his book, Spitting Image, of returning soldiers being spit upon by spoiled protesters. At Kent State, Ohio's guardsmen shot at veterans turned students, leading one to say that he came closer to dying on the campus of Kent State than he did in Vietnam. Kent State is best understood as a place where the children of blue-collar workers challenged racial discrimination, struggled for free speech, organization, and assembly, and slowly rose against the foreign war that claimed the lives of thousands of Ohioans, most of them working class. We know as well that the fatal shootings did not silence dissent. Rather, the killings provoked more of it and caused those who survived to labor for decades to ensure that the dead were properly remembered, as they are today in campus memorials and in the 3-year-old May 4th Visitor Center. Finally, and in conclusion, we understand that the guardsmen were trained, experienced, older than those they killed, and in most cases, lacking in remorse. Like the American Civil War, the sesquicentennial of which concluded just last year, the historical memory of the 1960s remains contested and often bitter. Thank you for listening and for giving me your kind attention. Where's Ken? I guess we have time for some questions. John.
Yeah, you didn't really answer the question why Kent State and why that part of the country. Do you have a theory? I mean, I certainly do, but I'd be curious what yours is.
Well, there were so many working class students there who had been politicized in their household, in their neighborhoods, and their communities of origin. And also, Kent State, the war became a very felt experience. It was not unusual for someone to have lost a brother or a cousin or a friend or a neighbor. So it was not, the war was not something abstract. And after, I would say for the better part of 7 or 8 years, of course there's a considerable turnover of students, but after a period of about 7 or 8 years, Kent students got a little tired of being on the receiving end of abuse from fraternity members and athletes who would sometimes throw rocks at them when they were holding silent vigils, overturning their literature tables, or punching them in a bar if they expressed an opinion against the war. All of these things happened to Kent State students. And after the African American students and the Students for Democratic Society blocked Oakland police recruiters in November of 1968, the Oakland police, some of you may know, had been responsible for shooting and wounding Black Panther Eldridge Cleaver. This happened on the same day as the Martin Luther King assassination, and shooting to death 17-year-old Bobby Hutton. The most radical students, I did not participate in this sit-in myself. I had been on the campus all of about 2 months. I was not about to get myself arrested my first quarter on the campus. But people who maybe were bolder or braver than I went in and stopped that protest from taking place. And in the aftermath of that, when they started marching around the campus, when they would be attacked by right-wing students, they began to fight back. And increasingly, the campus, there was an edge to the students at Kent State, and they became more and more militant. And then we also, of course, have on the other side, we have the mobilization of the Ohio National Guard, the many, many mobilizations. Part of this was by chance, however, because James Rhodes, there were demonstrations at Ohio State, and he had just finished a debate in Cleveland. He could have returned to Columbus, where, of course, the State House was and the governor's mansion, but he chose instead to take a helicopter ride to Kent and use that as the setting for his attack on the students at Kent, and to press this law and order theme. And he created a very volatile atmosphere, or contributed, I should say. I think the students, in a way, had already created a volatile atmosphere by their militancy, breaking out windows in downtown Kent, setting fire to the ROTC building. But he then came to Kent and said that the students were the worst type of people that we harbor in America, and said we were going to eradicate the students, and even if it meant shooting. And of course that keyed up the guardsmen, and then some of the guardsmen looked at Kent's students, even though many of them were working class themselves, and felt that they were privileged protesters. So I think you had these really polar opposite extremes that came together at Kent State in a way that perhaps it didn't in most places in the country, although certainly Kent State was not wholly exceptional in that regard. And when you threw in the mix of Rhodes's comments and some of the comments that had been made earlier by President Nixon, he referred, for those people who don't remember his quote, he referred to students in America as bums. We had a very volatile stew there, and it all exploded and came to a head on May 4th, 1970.
Could I follow up?
Sure.
Well, the reason I asked the question is because I was in Boston at the time. I had just graduated from college and was working in Boston. And after Cambodia, there was an explosion of protests there.
Yes.
Boston was a huge center of students, thousands of people in the streets. Windows were broken, confrontations with police, but nobody was shot there. And it seems to me, looking at it from a larger historical perspective, that if you look at it from the point of view of the government and the ruling class, your most dangerous place to have protests would be exactly as you described, in the center of industrial America, in the center of the country, and that had to be in a white, largely white student working class body, and that would be the place where, from the ruling class point of view, that you would want to take a stand and shoot people down and see if you could stop this radicalization from continuing.
Well, I have pointed out to people in the past that Kent was not the only place in the country where people were killed during the anti-war movement. But in every single instance where they were killed on the campus of a public university. They weren't killed at any private schools.
Right. That makes my point, I think.
Howie and then Sherry, I'll go over to you. And I failed, I had the best of intentions, but I failed to acknowledge Howie Lisnoff's presence here this evening. We connected online, but he's written a good many articles himself, and his own scholarship is devoted to the 1960s, and I just learned this evening that he happens to be friends with Alan Canfora, which I didn't know. So, Howie, welcome, and for your question.
Thank you, Tim. So, 13 seconds, 67 shots. You and 8 of your friends are wounded. Dean Caleb is wounded and he'll be paralyzed for life. Your friend Alan Canfora is shot through the wrist. You're shot. 4 of your friends are either dead or dying. So, what's it like for you on the ground, besides obvious pain?
I just wanted to keep myself as low as I possibly could, My friend Alan Canfora saw me sitting up. If anyone has ever been injured, you probably remember you want to look, if it's a head wound, you want to look in the mirror. If it's part of your body, you want to inspect the wound. That's what I was trying to do. I was trying to sit up and look down at my foot. And he yelled to me. I didn't even know he was so close to me. It turns out he was about 20 feet away. And he started yelling to me, stay down, it's birdshot. That's what he thought when it was being fired. So that kind of jolted me in my senses, and I lay as prone as possible until the firing was over with. Oddly, I think I talked about this too in June. Having been wounded may have served my life, or saved my life, because it knocked me down. And then I was on the ground, and the bullets were going off over my head. But if I had stayed erect and was running, I could have easily been hit in the back or the head. So one way or the other, I got on the ground.
And what goes through your mind in the hours that follow about the war? And no one knew that it was a very likely a conspiracy, either formed down on the playing field or up on Blanket Hill. But in terms of the war, now you're so connected to it at this point, connected to it for life. What happens? What do you think? What do your friends think?
Well, I'm going to answer that in the short run rather than the long run, because it would just be too involved. First of all, you can't imagine that this is happening to you. And like anyone else, we didn't know how long this was going to go on. And oddly, the guardsman who may have triggered the shootings is also the one who stopped it. You can see him in some of the photos, like pulling down the rifles, actually walking to the side of the guardsmen, grabbing their weapons and pulling them down. Because it was so noisy, it was so difficult to hear. But you would have liked to have had some way to defend yourself. That was my first thought. Here we are caught in the open. They're gunning us down, and we've got no way of returning fire or stopping this. We're all unarmed. We're defenseless. And that's a terrible feeling. But in terms of the longer aftermath later that day and the days following, much of that is just a blur, because being operated on and heavily sedated, and I don't remember it too well. I was asked by my editor to write about that hospital experience, and my memory was so fragmentary. And for people who've already read the book, you know this. I didn't want to use the first person pronoun. It was a study of other people rather than a memoir. And I was fortunate to find a nurse who had cared for me in Robinson Memorial Hospital, and she had given an interview in a magazine, and I used her recollection for this little sidebar in my chapter. So if you remember reading that. And she was an interesting person in her own right, Beatrice Mitchell, African-American nurse. Her son had been sent to Vietnam on February 1st of 1970. She was completely supportive of the protests. She felt that this would bring him home faster. And I'm happy to report to you all he did make it home okay. And I've since become friends with Mrs. Mitchell. So there were some other, Sherry.
Yeah, I was just curious about your thoughts on the role that...
The only journalist who's here, no, one of two journalists who's here tonight.
The role that the draft played in all this social dynamic of the people who were shooting and the people who were protesting. People today don't really understand the draft. It's not a familiar thing to them, but it had an iron grip on people in those days, especially young men. But everybody felt the grip of the draft.
Yes, they did, and it was ever present in the thoughts of young men once they turned 18. You had to sign up for the draft, and you were likely to be drafted. There's probably many stories in this room here tonight up until the time you were 26. I guess I'll answer that question with a story. On the memory page of my book, I list 3 people in alphabetical order, the last one being my father, who passed away in 2011. The first, and I list them alphabetically, the first man's name is Donald Angerman. I did not know him, but I knew his sister quite well, and she remains a good friend of mine. And he had gone to college in Michigan, and he had finished 2 years of school. And we have to keep in mind this was a very long war. And it was a large-scale war compared to some of the wars that we fought more recently. At least large-scale in terms of the number of Americans that were involved. And he reasoned that when he graduated in 1969, that the war would still be going on. And he was right about that. So school was, was much less expensive than it is today, but still it involved some cost. And he decided that after 2 years of school, that if he went into the service, got the military obligation out of the way, then he could come home and use the GI Bill and finish the schooling and have the government pay for it. And he wouldn't have to incur any debt, and he wouldn't have to obligate his parents any further. And he had 3 younger siblings, who all planned to go to college as well, and indeed they all did. So when the family was away on vacation, he was the oldest in the family, too old to be going with his parents on their summer vacation. He enlisted in the Marine Corps. And parents were horrified when they got home, found out about it. And we tend to forget, too, that in memory the war is so unpopular. We tend to forget that it took a long time for the majority of Americans to turn against it. Because when the war first starts, Americans rally around the flag and they rally around the country. We recall that with Iraq. And he was one of them. He wasn't necessarily opposed to the war. He hadn't been involved in any protests or anything like that. And he was this big strapping guy, almost looked like a football player. And joined the Marines, finished his basic, and was prepared, he was gung-ho, really, to go to Vietnam. He got there in March, shortly after the Tet Offensive was winding down at that point. And as soon as he got there, he realized that he'd made a huge mistake, and his letters home reflect that. And in part because of his size, do we have any Vietnam veterans in the audience? Okay. Well, some might be familiar with military hardware. He carried an M60 machine gun, which is a large and very potent weapon. And he was carrying that on patrol on April 27th, 1968. And it was either a grenade fragment or a rifle shot that ricocheted off his M60 and hit him in the head and killed him. And I read his letters for the first time last year, and they're very sobering. It's hard to keep your eyes dry when you read these accounts, because he was there about 6 weeks. And then there was also a very, very touching letter from his commanding officer. So he was a very esteemed young man, both his commanding officer and his fellow troops. Jeff?
Yeah, I'm kind of I don't remember exactly what happened with the National Guard after the event. Was there any type of, there were articles you've already quoted or told us about some of the people not having any remorse. But were there any repercussions? Was there any investigation?
There were numerous investigations.
And what were the results?
And there's so many that I really can't begin to do justice to it all. But the first one was first investigation where they had any power to indict anyone. That was conducted by Portage County, the county in which Ken is located, but it was paid for by the state of Ohio because it was such an expensive investigation, hundreds and hundreds of witnesses. And they also issued a report. The report, unbelievably, did not mention the fact that the guardsman had shot anybody fatally. And but they did indict 24 students and former students and non-students, mostly students, and one professor. It was a group known as the Kent 25. And long story behind that, we eventually were able to get most of those charges dismissed, but Like anyone who was involved in this kind of defense work in the 1960s or 70s, you know, it took a lot of effort and labor and money, you know, to get that done. There was also a petition that was signed by about 50,000 Americans, most of them Ohioans, calling for a federal grand jury, which President Nixon and John Mitchell, who was the Attorney General at the time, made clear that it was not going to happen. But over time, of course, we had the Watergate investigation. President Nixon's presidency was crippled by it. And we were on our fourth Attorney General, a man by the name of Elliot Richardson. And he was one of the last of the Massachusetts liberals, and very, very honorable man in my estimation. And he did commence an investigation. There were 8 guardsmen charged with conspiring to violate the civil rights of the students that they shot. There is no federal murder statute, you know, lawyers in the audience know that. But conspiracy is a hard charge to prove, and the federal judge, and this is complicated, everything about Kent State is complicated, and there's backstories, but the long and the short of it is that the federal judge, his name was Batista in Cleveland, was satisfied that the Justice Department had not made their case against these 8 Ohio guardsmen and dismissed the case before it went to a jury. There was subsequent 2 civil trials. The second one was very short. So in the President's Commission on campus unrest was another investigation. Ohio Highway Patrol investigated. And there were still others that I failed to mention. But no one ever went to jail, you know, for this, which is kind of par for the course in some respects. I say to people that we probably got more justice than most people do, you know, who are in these situations where they're either shot and wounded or shot fatally by uniformed authorities. I mean, it happens all the time in our country. People here know that. And I will say, too, that this has been a bit discomforting for me, but I've encountered people who can be completely sympathetic to what happened to us at Kent State. And when the subject turns to African Americans, totally different attitude.
Yeah, Jackson State.
And somebody say Jackson State? Yeah, at Jackson State, there were 2 students that were killed there. My wife and I visited there for the first time about 3 years ago and saw the site. I will say that the students at Kent State have probably done a little better in terms of dealing with this issue than the country at large, because right from the get-go there was a Kent-Jackson medical fund to raise monies for the people who were wounded. And of course many of the students at Jackson State badly needed that as well. Senator Kennedy helped us raise money. I was at the fundraiser at his home in Virginia, raised $65,000 just that one day. It was a considerable sum of money in 1970 for the wounded at Kent and Jackson. And whenever there's been a commemoration and there was an effort to stop construction of a gymnasium on the site where some of this occurred in 1977, the slogan was "Long live the spirit of Kent and Jackson State." And every year we have someone either from Jackson or someone representing Jackson to speak at the commemoration. The only book that's ever been published about Jackson State was published by Kent State University Press, quite fittingly. And there's a woman now by the name of Nancy Bristow, who teaches at the University of Puget Sound up in the Northwest, who's doing a book on Jackson State. She's been to Kent, and I've gone out there to meet with her, and we're trying to do all we can to help her with research. Let somebody who hasn't asked a question. Wayne.
Question about some commentary about.
And thank you for coming, by the way.
Sorry, I got lost. This part of it. A reference was made to some of the vets coming home from Vietnam being spit on. My understanding is that that's a widespread rumor in terms of the numbers of vets that happened to. And I understand that some investigations indicated a fairly limited number of people that actually happened to. And I wonder if you could comment on that. The other question is, I apologize if this was...
Let me take them one at a time and then deal with the follow-up. Were you here when I mentioned the Lemke book, Jerry Lemke, Spitting Image? Okay. I mentioned that right at the very end. He did an entire book devoted to that. categorically say that these kind of things didn't happen. I know of no instance where it happened at Kent State, because one of the reasons I became against the Vietnam War is I met guys who had fought in it, and I realized that I knew nothing about it, and I better shut up and start reading and listening to people who knew more about it than I did. So I always valued the counsel of Vietnam veterans, and certainly by 1972 they were leading the protest at Kent State, because they had more credibility than anyone else. And I also think that the involvement of, especially the demonstration in 1971 in April by the Vietnam veterans, that combined with the release of the Pentagon Papers, I think that was the real turning point in the Vietnam War. Some people suggest it was Kent State. I don't deny the importance of what happened at Kent State in terms of influencing opinion against the war. But after the veterans protested and the Pentagon Papers came out, you couldn't sell that war to anybody. So, when are you going to follow?
If you discussed this earlier, I apologize again to everybody and you. The origins of the demonstration, how did that come about? Was it spontaneous? Was a group of people behind that to organize the protest?
Well, the announcement against Cambodia came on, it was a Thursday night, April 30th, and it just sent people into a tizzy. Some of the people that I interviewed would be watching it in their dorm room, for instance, and people were screaming so loudly at the television that other people were doing everything they could to silence them so they could hear what was being said. And it was a warm evening, and some people had, if you lived off campus, you could hear people shouting from next door. And, this came up a number of times in some of the oral histories that I did. So that sparked these protests. The first protest at Kent later the next day was peaceful. But in fact, there were two protests that day at Kent. But in the evening, some students vented their fury, and they ran through the downtown section, and they were smashing windows out of the banks and the loan companies. And, it's vandalism. I mean, at the very least. I mean, you can't stand here and excuse it. You can understand it, but you don't excuse it. There was a ROTC building on the campus. It was one of 30 that was either burned or bombed in the month of May of 1970. And that had long been a target of anti-war protests. And in the minds of many of the anti-war radicals at Kent State, they put an end to ROTC. It would not only impair the U.S. war effort in Vietnam, which they were trying to do, people using extreme tactics, but it also might save the lives of some of the men who became second lieutenants upon graduating from the ROTC program and being sent to Vietnam. I'm sure a number of people in the room have seen the movie Platoon. Okay. Well, what you probably have never noticed is the T-shirt that the second lieutenant, who's wet behind the ears, he has to depend on the grizzled Sergeant Tom Berenger, to survive and give orders. The name of the school that he had on his shirt was Ohio State. So very few people have ever picked that up. Sir?
On the subject of people being spat on, this is funny, we all have our stories from the old days, but we were playing bridge last night with a couple, and we were telling them that we went to Oregon. What a nice place it was, and everything else. We said, California's nice too. The woman said, I've never been to California. I would never set foot in California because my brother came home from Vietnam to, I guess, LA. And they spat upon him, and he was in a fragile condition, and he never goes to his city. He lives in the country, and it's kind of, still in a very fragile state from his experiences in Vietnam. And so, at least that's one person I sort of take it that it happened.
Well, she may not want to ever go to Ohio either,
Right.
where they shot at him. And some of the guardsmen knew that there were veterans in the group, but they opened up anyway. So, I've never been anti-military. We buried my uncle not too long ago. He lived to the age of 99. He was in MIA in World War II. Fortunately, got back home. He was our family hero. He was a wonderful man. So I've never been anti-military, but and I certainly would never condone anybody doing anything like that, if indeed it happened. But Kent, Ohio was the only place where they ever shot at him. And I'd rather take some spit than a bullet.
Oh, no.
No, I understand your point, but I mean, this is something that people can convey, and I hope they get out of reading the book. Have you asked the question already, Jim?
Not yet.
Okay, please. In fact, I was hoping you would. So.
You made a comment about why Kent and not maybe Ohio or Cleveland. I have a funny feeling that in an urban situation, they might have not been able to control the situation, basically for some of the reasons that you alluded to in terms of the political makeup of what was going on in Cleveland. I don't know exactly where Ohio State is either.
It's in Columbus.
And that's another city. And I think it would have been harder for them to control it. I think they picked it because, one, it was a small town, and I think it was probably enough of some elements of the residents there who I think that they considered they wouldn't have to worry about any outsiders affecting it. That's just a guess on my part. I don't know if that's true or not.
Well, one thing we know for certain is that we don't know exactly. They use the self-defense theory. But the photographs, of which there are many, give lie to that because they weren't in danger of being overrun. And there's also some videotape of it as well.
No, I'm talking just about the logistics, not the shooting itself. I think that was just, I think that was a bunch of people who basically got ideologically convinced that these people were dangerous. In other words, they didn't view them as protesters.
It made it easier to pull the triggers.
Right.
But they also, one thing no one disputes, regardless of on which side you come down on this, and that's that these guys were really tired. A lot of them had been on duty for a week. Some of them, there were, this is maybe typical of the Army or the military. They, if their tents weren't aligned properly, some of them were woken up and they desperately needed to sleep, and then they had to realign their tents and then they could go back to sleep. A lot of these guys were trying to get by in like 2 or 3 hours of sleep and were really sleep deprived. And in fairness, one of the things that I maintain in this book is that it was never my intention to cast the students at Kent State as like victims or angels. I saw them as people who were maybe agents of change, unarmed combatants trying to stop a war. And they did some things that were against the law, but they felt that they were, if their actions were unlawful, that they were protesting something that was even more unlawful. That's how it was rationalized.
I'll keep quiet. One other thing that you mentioned there, I think, which I remember personally, was this, what I call this rumor or myth. Myth is a better word. That these kids in college, have it easy. And just what I call this resentment, this notion.
I think there was some of that. Right?
Resentment, but it's at least in the examples you rendered concerning what the verbalization was of the soldiers who had shot. It seems to me that was part of it. Not only part of it was being afraid, and part of it was basically labeling them. In our terminology today, we would call them the other.
Yes, I've used that very word myself. And it's interesting, too, that at least one of the guardsmen, he was indicted in 1973 and then went on trial in 74, was himself a Kent State student. A guy who I quoted, James Pierce. I think there were some other hands where people haven't. I'm going to call on my cousin, Barbara.
Right. Congratulations on the book, Thomas. To write this, and how long did it take you to write?
A long time. I'll let it go with that.
Right. And all I remember is I lived with his father and grandmother, and my mother was his aunt. And I was a young married person. My husband was in the New York National Guard, and I was living away from your area. So all I would hear was, we pray that Thomas Mark is all right. That's all I knew about.
My father's Thomas Victor.
That's all I knew about Kent State. And now that I've grown up older and can read your book, I really admire you for writing it and keeping it in the historical facts.
Well, thanks, Barbara. Let's remember, too, my father also served in the New York National Guard during the Korean War, so.
Did he really?
Yeah. Please, yes.
I have a very strange question.
I'm sure it's not. Go on ahead.
Well, it's kind of weird. I'm just wondering, I know it, I stop and hesitate when I hear it. You hear the song, For Dead in Ohio. Do you turn it off, or you just, is it hit you that, yes, it did happen, or how do you?
Well, there's as I said, there's always a backstory to the things that Kent state. There's some people doing, my nephew does work in television in New York City, and very often these private film companies do the stories, film the stories, and then they sell them to the networks or to the cable outlets. And there's one that will eventually air on CNN. It's called Music in the 60s. And I've been contacted by one of the fellows who's making this. He wants me to come down to New York and tell the story. In about 4 or 5 months before the Kent shootings, my friend Alan and I, we went to Cleveland, a cellar club called Le Cave, to hear Neil Young play. He had broken up with the Buffalo Springfield and was now with his band Crazy Horse. And we had the opportunity to meet him and talk with him for about 10 minutes. And then right after the Kent shootings, the photo that is on the cover of my book, a much larger representation of it was in one of this 2-page spread in Life magazine. And David Crosby took the photo and he laid it down, or the magazine, he laid it down in front of Neil Young and he said, "Look what this kid is," pointing to Alan Kent Ford, waving the flag at the National Guard. He said, "Look what this kid is doing to stop the war in Vietnam. What are we doing?" So Young's response to that challenge was to pick up his guitar, go off on his own that afternoon and write the song Ohio.
Yeah.
And to this day, I mean, I've never seen Neil Young since, and to this day he probably doesn't know that he had met like 2 people, one of whom was in the photo that was being pointed out to him by David Crosby that caused him to write the song. So I'll let it go with that. Sir?
The papers reported that the shooting started because a guard threw a gas canister. A student picked it up, threw it back, it hit the guard, and the rifle went off. That's what the reporting was. And then they said to shoot and the rest of the guns. Is that accurate?
No, that did not happen that way.
Is that part of
There were students throwing tear gas canisters back at the guard. That's absolutely true. You can see photographs of them.
Okay.
And there was a student by the name of Jim Menard who was following the guard contingent up the hill. He had this rock, and Jones had his .22, and he said, "Come on, I'll fix you." And then the kid backed off. But there were kids throwing rocks at them as they were retreating. There wasn't any guardsman that was injured severely enough to require any medical treatment, but there were some guardsmen that were hit by rocks that day. That's undeniable. And in some people's mind, let's face it, that's easily enough justification to kill somebody. I mean,
Why did they have real bullets?
well, if you have a gun, why would you not have real bullets? I mean, that came as a surprise to many people. I mean, it didn't surprise me. I was surprised that they opened fire on us at 12:30 in the afternoon in front of all these photographers and news teams, because there were people there to document it. But the fact that things like that happen in the United States, that wasn't necessarily a surprise to me in the least. When I was 19, in Chicago, Illinois, there were 2 members of the Black Panther Party, Mark Clark and the better known Fred Hampton. Fred was 21, he was the deputy chairman of the Illinois Black Panther Party. Right. And he and Mark Clark were killed in their beds. And they had been given Seconal by an undercover agent. There was no way that they could even wake up to even defend themselves. And I remember seeing pictures of the police carrying their bodies out, grinning from ear to ear. And I had friends who had heard Fred Hampton speak in Chicago. in October of that year, and they came back and they told me what a wonderful leader he was. And that left quite an impression on me, you might say. So I knew things like that happened in the United States. I just didn't think it was going to happen, 12:30 in the afternoon, in front of hundreds, if not thousands, of witnesses with all these photographers to capture what had taken place. How about maybe one more? And I thought we'd quit at 8. It's 20 after already. I want to leave a little time if anyone wants to pick up a book. So we'll take one more, and then I'd be happy to talk to people afterwards. Sir, you've been patient. Thank you.
In the information gathering and the investigations that took place later, any discussion on why they used the firearms rather than water cannons or tear gas or other less lethal methods?
Or rubber bullets, or did they have them then?
No, they had rubber bullets. They
could have used those.
Yeah, the police did use those at Kent in 1971, 1972.
Oh.
They actually can be. You could blind or kill someone if you're hit the temple or the eye, but still, the point is well taken. It's a far less lethal way of dealing with something. That was just their stock and trade. Every place they were sent, they were armed with the same weapons. They had been armed with those weapons when they were policing the truck strike. And some of the guardsmen, or some of the truckers did have arms, not military weaponry the way the guardsmen did, but a number of them had 38s and other kind of handguns. And some of them were shooting at the trucks. And I don't know if any guardsmen came under fire from Teamsters, but they had to contend with that. And that probably further contributed to all of this. I'd be the last person in the world to excuse what took place at Kent State, but we have to appreciate the context too in which all of this occurred. So.
I know you said that was the last question.
I know, but Jeff, I got a soft spot for you.
I've always been very hostile to Richard Nixon.
Okay.
And
so was my father.
I don't know whether this is in the book or not, but there's some quotes from him that have come out of the Nixon case about the post Kent State. Have you seen those? Are you familiar with those? Basically saying this should teach the students a lesson. This should have a dampening effect on protests on campuses around the country. Have you come across those yet?
No, I haven't. I'm familiar with the public statement that was issued through his press secretary, Ron Ziegler. But I don't, and I've read the Haldeman diaries. The taping system, of course, wasn't installed at that time. Are people aware of this? The tapes that brought down his presidency. I don't think that they were operative until sometime around 1971. So a lot of what we know as a result of the Haldeman diaries. But if there's other information, I would welcome seeing that.
What did the public statement say at the time?
Well, through his press secretary, I think let me see if I can recall this exactly. When dissent turns to violence, violence invites tragedy. I'm quite sure. It might be a paraphrase, but I think it's almost exact. And that struck some people as uncaring and cold. I'll leave it to you to determine whether it was or not. All right, well, thank you very much.